Passionate commitment to social justice can never be a substitute for knowing what you are talking about. In this episode of Philosophers Explained by me, Stephen Hicks, we turn to Thomas Sowell's 1989 Affirmative Action, a Worldwide Disaster, in which the philosophical economist takes up issues of race, ethnicity, and discrimination. Let's go to the text. All right, a word about our title here, Affirmative Action, a Worldwide Disaster. Now, right from the beginning, the title indicates that Sowell will be arguing against affirmative action. There's also an interesting use of quotation marks there, the scare quotes, as we call it, which indicates even some distancing from that label for whatever it is that we are arguing against. Also, note the date of publication here, 1989. Sowell is going to argue that this piece is coming in the context after about 20 years or so of arguing and practicing with respect to affirmative action programs in the United States. And that means the dates also are significant. So if we think of the 1960s, for example, in the United States and more broadly in the Western countries, that comes at the end of perhaps 2 centuries since the Enlightenment of a reinvigoration of individualism, the great battles against slavery, social educational work against various forms of racism, ethnocentrism, old-fashioned sexisms, and so forth. And the idea had been, for much of the 1700s, 1800s, on into the first half of the 20th century, so what we need to do is to teach people to judge each other as individuals by their character, by their habits, by their actions, by their accomplishments, that we should eliminate double standards in the law and also double standards in many social institutions and so forth. And on the basis of that, we will make progress against those atavistic forms of collectivism. But by the 1960s, there had been a philosophical and a cultural change that argued that we needed stronger medicine, that rather than simply being colorblind or being gender blind, that we needed to take old-fashioned discrimination and, of course, try to fight against it, but use different kinds of discrimination, positive discriminations or well-meaning discriminations to correct the remaining problems of discrimination in society. And then modern affirmative action programs in North America and other parts of the world then came into existence with widespread experimentation. So what Sowell is doing then toward the end of the 1980s is to say that we've done now 20 years of experimenting, 20 years of argumentation. Some of the affirmative action programs have been subject to test cases and made their way all through the Supreme Court, as they did in the 1970s and on in the 1980s. So now it's time for a social scientific assessment of affirmative action. Now, he wants to point out this is not going to be just a parochial American discussion. He says affirmative action programs have been a worldwide phenomenon, and he's had a look at how they've gone in India, Nigeria, Australia, Guyana, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and so forth. And despite different labelings, what the programs all have in common as this idea in the yellow just at the middle of the page here, what we want to do is when we are talking about coveted positions, admissions to college, getting a job, getting a promotion, and so forth, that what we will do is we will use racial, ethnic, and or gender or economic status criteria, organizing people into groups and then allocate positions according to people's group memberships. And this is going to then supersede, as Sowell puts it, affirmative action always means to supersede the competition of the marketplace or of academia. So that then is to say we're not going to use or use only merit or character or accomplishments or credentials. We're going to use instead these other group-based characteristics. Now, the labeling is issue, and of course we always want to have nice-sounding labels for whatever our programs are, particularly ones that are controversial. So Sowell notes that while the American phrase affirmative action is used in Australia and Canada. Other countries have used a variety of other phrases, such as positive discrimination in India, sons of the soil preferences in Indonesia, Malaysia, standardization Sri Lanka, and reflecting the federal character of the country, Nigeria. Now, people who are opposed to affirmative action programs will sometimes call it reverse discrimination. And for a while, there was a debate about whether we should call it reverse discrimination, thereby signaling that we are just reversing the direction of discrimination, or whether that is already to build in a pejorative and a negative argument. And then others want to then say, instead of reverse discrimination, we could call it positive discrimination, positive being something that is good. So this is going to be a good kind of discrimination. But of course, discrimination still has that pejorative seemingly built into it, the way most people use it by the time we get seriously into the 20th century. Gender discrimination, sex discrimination, ethnic discrimination, religious discrimination, racial discrimination, those are all just reflexively bad words. So affirmative action, taking the discrimination word out of it entirely, came to be the word that was used mostly. So Thomas Sowell then is going to accept that we're talking about affirmative action, but indicate some distancing by use of the scare quotations. And the more important issue, though, is going to be what we are doing. We're going to supersede, as he puts it, the competition criteria and use group-based memberships in awarding petitions. Now, what has been the effect? And he wants to say then that when we do the social science, we look at the actual effects of these programs in various countries around the world. Some common results emerge, and he lists 4 of them from the beginning. So he wants to say, without exception, preferential programs, even when explicitly and repeatedly defined as temporary, have tended not only to persist, but also to expand in scope. So sometimes the argument for affirmative action was, yes, we have made significant progress against old-fashioned sexism, old-fashioned racism, and so forth, but there are some kind of hard-to-crack remaining pockets of bad discrimination. So just temporarily, maybe for a generation, or just for a few years, we will use positive discrimination, affirmative action, and so forth to get rid of that, and then those programs can just go away, their historical function having been done. Sowell is indicating that seems not to be the case when we look at the actual track records. Often, when we are doing affirmative action programs, we are worried about those who seem to be falling behind economically or in terms of social status. And so what we want to do is use affirmative action to benefit those who have really fallen behind the most. And then Sowell, in his second point, goes on to argue the benefits of affirmative action have usually gone disproportionately to those members already more fortunate. So if we're talking about college admissions or admissions into graduate schools, it's then typically going to be families of whatever group we are interested in who have already made it into the middle class, say, right, or into one of the upper economic stratas of society. They are the ones who get their kids the education, they have the connections, they know how to work the system to get their kids the advancements. And so those are the ones, those kids, but if they are from the proper group or the targeted group, they will get the affirmative action benefits, and really the least advantage or the least well off in the groups don't tend to get the benefits of the affirmative action. Third point, group polarization has tended to increase in the wake of preferential programs. So the idea here is that old-fashioned discrimination is a kind of group polarization. There's this group and there's this group, and they dislike each other, and maybe this group is in a position to keep this group down. And so we have that bad kind of polarization. But then when we introduce affirmative action rather than making that problem better by giving preferred positions to members of this group that have been suffering from old-fashioned discrimination and getting them into positions of accomplishment and showing everybody that they can succeed. Instead, the polarization gets worse for various reasons, and so we'll talk about those later in the essay. And then fraudulent claims of belonging to the designated beneficiary groups have been widespread. So it becomes an invitation to fraud. If it's the case that you are going to increase your chances of graduate school admission or increase your chances of getting a prestigious promotion or a job, if you can show that you are a member of a certain group, then of course that incentivizes lots of people to try to fake being a member of that group in order to get the position. Now, a methodological point, and Sowell trained first as an economist, and he did a significant amount of empirical social science work and so forth, and he wants to emphasize that we should be paying very careful attention not just to the rhetoric, not just to the ideas or the ideals or the abstracted arguments, but see what actually happens. And here's a strong line here. In the United States, as in other countries around the world, the empirical consequences of preferential policies have received much less attention than the rationales and goals of such policies. So the idea here is that this is a problem. Sometimes we might say, well, this is our good theory, and we're so committed to the theory, we think it sounds so nice, that we just don't even pay attention to empirical consequences. And even if the empirical consequences are negative, we just don't pay attention to them, and so we continue to advocate and practice our theory, despite often negative consequences. Sometimes it might come out of a more moral, philosophical position of judging only on the basis of motives, not judging on the basis of consequences. So we might be more deontological. We have a duty or an obligation to follow certain moral principles, and the consequences don't really matter. And Sowell then is signaling, no, actually consequences do matter. There should be a marriage between those two, and we should always be judging motives, not only abstractly in terms of what most motives are, but those motives as they work out in consequences. So perhaps we need to think about that sometimes dichotomy in moral philosophy. Nonetheless, what Sowell does want to argue is now we have enough of a track record around the world and enough of social science that's been done to realize that some of the hopes or some of the beliefs or some of the assumptions that affirmative action programs are based upon are illusions, and nonetheless these illusions continue to flourish, and so those are the illusions that he wants to take up. Two major illusions. Foremost among these illusions is the belief that group disparities in representation, notice also those put in scare quotes, are suspect anomalies that can be corrected by having the government temporarily apportion places on the basis of group membership. So what we then do is we're not looking at people as individuals so much anymore and looking at their characters. We step back and we start looking at various groups, and we do statistical analysis about how many people are in each group and how many people in each group are getting positions at universities and jobs, promotions, and so forth. And if we find that the group statistics are unequal or disparate, relative to their overall representation in whatever the population is, then we are going to say that is a problem that we need to solve by means of affirmative action programs. And Sowell is arguing that that is an illusion. Right. Now, there's another illusion, and this one is a moral illusion. The prime moral illusion is that the preferential policies compensate for the wrongs suffered. So often here there's a notion of justice. Sometimes it's a matter of social justice, that there have been wrong things that have happened in the past, and that affirmative action can be then a way of rectifying those problems that happened in the past. It's a kind of compensation. It's a kind of retroactive justice. And Sowell is going to argue that that also is an illusion. And we have a section devoted to that argument as well. Okay, so let's start with the statistical disparities issues, right? And we'll notice consistently disparities and imbalances that people will cite with respect to various sorts of statistics. And Sowell wants to say that in most cases, these are not really disparities if we know what's going on, but if we are monomaniacally, right, using only ethnicity or using only race or using only sex as our social variable, and in some cases assuming nefarious or negative discrimination as the only causal force, then we're going to be able to falsely generate all sorts of scary-looking statistics. So the idea that large statistical disparities between groups are unusual and therefore suspicious is commonplace, but only among those who have not bothered to study the history of racial, ethnic, and other groups in the countries around the world. So what we might then do, for example, is say that, just to take an example of sex, we might say women and men are roughly 50% of the population each. Right, so we abstract out to women as a group and then men as a group. And so then what we have is a statistic that tells us what their proportional membership in the overall population is. Then we will take a particular profession, say. We will say neurosurgeons as a group. And then we will notice that, and I'm making this number up, in that group only, say, 15% of the neurosurgeons are women and 85% of them are men. Now then we have in that subgroup a statistical disparity relative to the overall group. And then we know that there has been a history of discrimination, so we bring that in, and then we say this must be due to sexism and only due to sexism, and therefore we need to do something about that. And that pattern then will be repeated with respect to ethnic groups, racial groups, religious groups, and so forth. Now, that theoretical way of using statistics, Sowell then wants to say, is done in abstraction or ignorance of the empirical facts on the ground that we can learn from history, and the history matters. So he goes on to talk about some of these things. One reason for statistical disparities is that it is common for different groups to rely on different mobility ladders. Some choose the military, some the bureaucracy, and some various parts of the private sector. So that then is to say, if you take racial groups, or you take ethnic groups, or religious groups, or gender groups, absent any amount of discrimination, people in those groups, for whatever other reasons, will choose different mobility routes. And he goes on to give some examples here. So if we go to Africa, go to South Africa, we go to the Afrikaners in particular, they are a certain percentage of the overall South African population, but because of their internal habits, they are more likely to go into the army. And it may just be that there are family traditions that encourage Afrikaners, youngsters, to go into the army more than other parts of the military. And it's not the fact that there is some sort of discrimination. There may be discrimination at work, but there are lots of other issues at work as well. Also, he gives the example of the Chinese in Malaysia's Air Force, that the Chinese, as they leave China and go to various countries, they may be an ethnic minority, but they will develop traditions as a result of their ethnicity, their family structure, and so forth, to pursue certain mobility ladders. And once they've got a foothold in there, they then are able then to maintain a larger statistical representation in that group than you might otherwise think. He gives an example in the next paragraph of Jews in the clothing industry in the United States, in Argentina, and Chile as well. So we might say Jews are this portion of the population overall, but they are this proportion in the clothing industry. And then we might then say, well, is it the case that in the clothing industry we have discrimination in favor of Jews and discrimination against members of other cultures or other religions. And the argument that Sowell makes is to say it's not discrimination that's going on here. Instead, there's a historical point. If you go back before the Jews immigrated to these various places, when many of them were in Eastern Europe, for various historical reasons, they were concentrated already in the clothing industry as seamstresses, as tailors, and so forth. And so when they migrated in large numbers to these other places of the world, they brought their skills. And they had a higher percentage of people with that skill set than other immigrant groups when they arrived in the United States. And so the statistical disparity falls out of the history, not out of discrimination that's happening recently in the countries they migrated to. German minorities have been dominant as pioneers in piano manufacturing. Italian fishermen, Japanese farmers, Irish politicians have been among the many other minority groups with special success in special fields in various countries without any ability to keep others out. So some cultures may then specialize in different kinds of professions. Some will emphasize education, some will emphasize sports, some will emphasize whatever. And so because of those traditions internal to those ethnic groups, racial groups, religious groups, and so forth, you will end up with unequal representation in the overall populations. And discrimination, not to deny that there has been discrimination, that there is discrimination, but it's a mistake to say all statistical disparities or even a significant amount of the statistical disparities are due to inappropriate discriminations. But to repeat, groups who are in no position to discriminate against anybody have often been overrepresented in coveted position. So the Chinese in Malaysian universities, the Tamils in Sri Lankan universities, the Southerners in Nigerian universities, all during the 1960s, and Asians in American universities today. So it may be that these various groups, they're a minority within the overall culture that they exist in, and they have been discriminated against by the other ethnic groups, racial groups, and so forth, but nonetheless they have by whatever methods they have used, been able to overcome that discrimination and achieve over-representation. So discrimination as a factor needs to be taken into account only to the extent that we've done the social science that's isolated that variable. We can't just assume that it is the operative one. Now, why this matters, Sowell wants to go on, is not only in corporations and government work as well, but when we start to enshrine these kinds of assumptions about statistical disparities and its relationship to discrimination in the law, then we have a very heavy-duty set of institutions with heavy-duty consequences that are going to come about. So, some U.S. Supreme Court justices have repeatedly treated statistical disparities as tantamount to discrimination. So that then is to say, even in the United States Supreme Court, as these cases reached them in the 60s and 70s and on into the 1980s, that statistical disparities as automatically indicating that discrimination is the causal factor at work has become an automatic assumption. He goes on to argue in the Weber case and also in the Bakke case. The argument in the case of the Bakke case was with respect to admissions into medical school. And we're starting to say, why do we have a statistically disproportionate number of students who are white or students who are black or who are Asian and not students who are Hispanic or black? And the argument is then that that is, on the face of it, indication that medical schools have been discriminating, or universities have been discriminating, or the education system has been discriminating, and then as a consequence that the University of California at Davis has an obligation to correct for that discrimination, overcome those statistical disparities by admitting members of all racial groups more or less according to their statistical representation in the overall population. And so the formulation that is used is then to say what we need to do is, assuming discrimination, racial discrimination is the cause, putting minority applicants in the position they would have been in if not for the evil of racial discrimination. So, discrimination caused the statistical disparity, right? And so what we need to do is have an affirmative action program that will correct for that. Now, what Sowell goes on to argue here is first not an issue of morality or an issue of justice and so forth, but an issue of cognition, an issue of knowledge. Quote, all of this presupposes a range of knowledge that no one has ever possessed. How would we know if there had been no discrimination in the previous generation, in the previous 2 generations, in the previous however many generations, where a given group would be in today's society had there not been any discrimination? That's a huge question. What would count as the evidence? What would count as the statistical data that we would use to be able to judge what the statistics would look like now absent that particular factor? And what Sowell wants to argue is that that is an impossible question to answer on cognitive grounds. And he gives some then examples. Suppose we go back in history, and we say we're trying to correct for some past discriminations and so forth, or past injustices. What would the average Englishman be like today but for the Norman conquest? So we go back to year 1066, and then we fast forward 800 and something years, and we say, okay, what would the average Englishman look like if the Normans hadn't conquered England? What would the average Japanese be like but for the enforced isolation of Japan for 2.5 centuries under the Tokugawa shoguns? What would the Middle East be like but for the emergence of Islam? Now, it's a fun exercise to engage in what if history, to go back in history, take history as it was, and then imagine that some important historical event did not occur, take that out of the equation, and then make projections about how things would have gone. But is that social science or is that imaginative fiction? And do we want to say that we actually get knowledge out of that? Sowell wants to say no. In any other context besides preferential policy issues, the presumption of knowing the answers to such questions would be regarded as ridiculous, even as intellectual speculation, much less as a basis for serious legal action. So why are we doing this? This is Sowell's question in contemporary United States when we should know better. To know how one group's employment, education, or other patterns differ statistically from another's is usually easy. What is difficult to know are the many variables determining the interest, skill, and performance of those individuals from various groups who are being considered for particular jobs, roles, or institutions. That's more difficult. What is virtually impossible to know are the patterns that would exist in a non-discriminatory world, the deviations from which would indicate the existence and magnitude of discrimination. Now, that's abstractly put, but then we go on to consider some of the other variables aside from racial discrimination or ethnic discrimination or sex discrimination that we would have to take into account if we were to take this exercise seriously. Why do we have disparities across various groups? Well, what about age distribution and geographic distribution are only 2 very simple factors which can play havoc with the assumption that groups would be evenly or randomly distributed in occupations and institutions in the absence of discrimination. So we might then say, here's sports, right? Why do we have a whole lot of young people playing sports and playing professional sports, and we don't have old people playing professional sports? Clearly, it must be age discrimination. And now there's a little bit of sarcasm that's going on there. We say, well, no, obviously, it's not just discrimination on the basis of age that's going on there. There are merit, accomplishment, interest factors that are going on. And so we would have to take that account. When one group's median age is a decade younger than another's, it is not not at all uncommon. That alone may be enough to cause the younger group to be statistically overrepresented in sports, crime, and entry-level jobs, etc., etc. Another simple factor operating against an even representation of groups is that many ethnic groups are distributed geographically in patterns differing from one another. So, example, it would be unlikely that American ethnic groups concentrated in cold states like Minnesota and Wisconsin would be as well represented among citrus growers and tennis players as they are on hockey teams and among skiers. So if we were then to say, here are people who came from Germanic families raised in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and we notice that they are this percentage of the population. Then we go and we look at the group of people who are working in the citrus fruits industry, and we find that they are this percentage of the overall population, but they're only this percentage of the people who are working in the citrus fruit industry. And then we say, oh, we must be discriminating against people of Germanic background. We say, no, it's not discrimination on the basis of ethnicity. It's where they grew up and their geographical climate. We don't grow citrus fruits in the northern part of the country. Some of them, of course, will leave the north and go to the south, but that's going to be a smaller percentage. Why do we not find, just to take another example, Hispanic people from the southern part of the United States or recent immigrants from Central and South America widely represented in hockey? Well, because hockey is played in the northern, colder parts of the country. These are people who come from hot and more temperate parts of the world. They don't have a tradition of hockey, and so we wouldn't then say this, Hispanics are this percentage of the overall population, but only this percentage of hockey players. Clearly, hockey is discriminating against them. That would be just bad social science. So, aside from racial discrimination, gender discrimination, and so forth, we have to look at all sorts of other factors and not just monomaniacally focus on the one. A summary point here. Lest the point be misunderstood, while these two simple and obvious factors, age and location, are capable of disrupting the even representation that many assume to exist in the absence of discrimination, that is to say, we should not use as an axiom or as an implicit or explicit assumption that if there were no discrimination of the wrong kinds, we would have even distributions of people from all of the groups in all of the professions and occupations according to their in the general population. That's not true. There are also innumerable other factors of varying degrees of complexity and influence that can do the same. The purpose here is not to pinpoint the reasons for intergroup differences. History and sociology, very interesting, but that's not what we're doing here, or even to assume that they can all be pinpointed, but rather to show how arbitrary and unfounded is the assumption that groups would be evenly represented in the absence of discrimination. What are the effects of centuries of injustice punctuated by recurring outbursts of lethal mass violence against the overseas Chinese in South Asia or against the Jews in Europe? Both groups are generally more prosperous than their persecutors. So what we can say is if we are looking at some groups that have been historically subject to really bad persecutions, what then is going to explain why they are overrepresented in various success measures? Right? The overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia and the Jews in Europe are two examples here. Would they still have been more prosperous in the absence of such adversities? Well, perhaps. But many peoples with a long history of peace and with prosperity supplied by nature itself have quietly stagnated. This is not to say that the Jews and the Chinese would have done so. It is only to say that we do not know and cannot know. So affirmative action programs based on this assumption are then based on a cognitive impossibility. They are building into their program a kind of epistemologically impossible task for themselves to accomplish if they're going to take that project seriously. All right, moving on from statistical disparities to the issue of honors. and sometimes backlash types of issues, and making disparities worse and polarizations worse as a result of affirmative action programs. Getting an admission to college should be a thing of honor. Getting into a graduate school, a thing of honor. Getting a job, getting a promotion, and so forth. These are accomplishments, and aside from the material benefits, there should be social esteem benefits, a sense of personal honor, a sense of social honor that comes along with them. Sowell's next question is, what do affirmative action programs do to honor? Preferential honors for members of particular groups can easily render suspect not only those particular honors, but also honors fully merited and awarded after free and open competition. If 1/5 of the honors received by preferred groups are awarded under double standards, the other 4/5 are almost certain to fall under a cloud of suspicion as well. So suppose we take a racial group and we want to help this racial group for whatever reason we think it is underrepresented. So what we are going to do is we're going to admit a certain, say, a number of this racial group into a law school. But of that group, 20% of them are going to be admitted under affirmative action. That is to say, they didn't necessarily get into that law school because they had good grades, good scores on the LSAT, good letters of recommendation from their professors. They get in because they are a member of the preferred group that we are trying to get more members of into the law school. Now, there's the other then 80% who are in that group, but they earned their way into the law school. How do we look at that 80% if we are not members of the admission committee and we don't know exactly why they got into the law school? So it raises a cloud of suspicion, and that is an injustice to those members of that group who actually earned their way into the law school. Sowell goes on to argue, this is not a trivial point. Honor is more than a sop to personal vanity. It is a powerful incentive which accomplishes many social tasks, including tasks that are too arduous and dangerous to be compensated by money. In more mundane matters, honor and respect from one's colleagues and subordinates are important and sometimes indispensable aids, without which even the most talented and conscientious individuals sometimes cannot fulfill their promise. So put ourselves now, to change the example, in the case of a workplace. Suppose I am working and I know that my company has just hired, say, 20 new employees, and they're members of different races and so forth. And I know that certain races are being targeted and they are being given the jobs, not necessarily because they are the most qualified for the jobs, but they are members of the preferred group. Now, I am going to work with these people, but how am I going to treat people? I don't know of any given member of that group whether that person earned the position or got it as a result of affirmative action. Am I going to treat my new colleagues appropriately, or will the affirmative action program cause me to be less forthcoming, less collegial, less honoring of these new employees, and thereby cause dissension and problems and tensions of various sorts in the workplace? Carrying on this quotation, to jeopardize the respect and recognition of individuals from preferred groups by rewarding honors tainted with double standards is not only to downgrade their own achievements, but also to downgrade their chances of accomplishing those achievements in the first place. An example now, switching to education. For example, minority faculty members have often complained about a lack of intellectual and research interaction with their colleagues and of being thought of as affirmative action professors. After the media revealed that black students were admitted to the Harvard Medical School with lower qualifications, white patients began to refuse to be examined by such students. So we may have, and we do have, a problem of, say, continued racial discrimination. And the point here is going to be that the affirmative action programs are not solving that problem. They're actually making that problem worse by introducing a new reason for people to discriminate on the basis of race. What about historical compensation? What if we say we're not so much just looking at the present and trying to find or get equal group memberships, get rid of various current statistical disparities? What if we say what we are trying to do is make up for past wrongs? So in history, we know there are various injustices that have occurred, and we need to compensate out of a commitment to justice. When a wrong has been done, we want that injustice to be made up for. The wrongs of history have been invoked by many groups in many countries as a moral claim for contemporary compensation. Now, assuming for the sake of argument that the historical claims are factually correct, many of the the claims about past discrimination are in fact correct. Of course, we want to do more history to make sure that some of them are not overstated or understated. We need very good history if we're going to bring the history in. Assuming then that the general historical claims are factually correct, there's a problem here. To transfer benefits between two groups of living contemporaries because of what happened between two sets of dead people is to raise the question of whether any sufferer is in fact being compensated. Only where both wrongs and compensation are viewed as collectivized and inheritable does redressing the wrongs of history have a moral or even a logical basis. So suppose we want to say that the great historical sin that we are trying to compensate for is the sin of slavery. But then we point out that slavery ended in the United States in 1865. If we then jump a whole century later, all of the slaves, the former slaves, have now died. All of the people who were engaging in the slavery, owning slaves and treating their slaves unjustly, they also have died. So it is true that that was a great historical injustice, but we cannot compensate the slaves because they are no longer living. And we cannot force the slave owners to pay the compensation to make up for their injustice because they are no longer alive. Instead, at most what we have is descendants after multiple generations of the slaves and descendants of the slave owners. And then what we would then need to do, if we assume that the descendants of the slave owners inherit the guilt, and that the descendants of the slaves inherit the need to be compensated, we would then have a very difficult problem of finding the right people, and is it just to make the one pay for the other? Is it just for the one to receive from the other? These are grave issues of morality that this historical compensation is raising. If we then back away from that exercise of trying to identify the individual descendants on both sides, and we just generalize it and to say, well, maybe it's just this racial group. Anybody who, say, in the black group, since slavery in the United States was mostly an issue of black people being enslaved, and it was mostly white people who were doing the enslaving. So therefore, we don't focus so much on individual descendants. We just say we now have a lot of white people and we now have a lot of black people, and we're going to say that white people as a group owe compensation to black people as a group, and black people as a group are owed compensation by white people as a group. That is raising even more thorny questions about the nature of this guilt that is supposed to be collectivized and inherited across multiple generalizations. So the way Sowell puts all of that is this way: the biological continuity of generations lends plausibility to the notion of group compensation, but only if guilt can be inherited. Is guilt something that can be inherited, or is that a collectivized notion, and that guilt is something that is individual? You are guilty or worthy of praise or worthy of compensation only according to what you as an individual have done or what has happened to you as an individual. Otherwise, there are simply windfall gains and windfall losses among contemporaries according to the accident of their antecedents. But justice should not be a matter of accident. Justice is a matter of a wrong was done, an identifiable wrong was done, it's a measurable wrong, and we are causing the compensation to be paid by the right parties to the right parties. He gives an example. This is a more recent example. No one would advocate that today's Jews are morally entitled to put today's Germans in concentration camps in compensation for the Nazi Holocaust. That seems like an obvious injustice. So then, if we take that issue of religious and ethnic intolerance and discrimination and genocide and apply it to other dimensions, race, gender, sex, and so forth, it would be exactly the same argument. Sowell then goes on to say, well, sometimes the argument is a little more subtle than that, sometimes a more sociological rather than moral claim is made that living contemporaries are suffering from the effects of past wrongs. So we're not trying to make up for the past wrongs, but rather those past wrongs led to effects that are multiply existing across generations, and it's those effects that we are trying to make up for. So again, we are more contemporary in our analysis, and it is these effects which must be offset by compensatory preferences. And then Sowell wants to argue that there is, of course, a temptation here, and there are effects across generations, but we are going to run into another cognitive issue of trying to figure out what those effects are across the generations and measuring them accurately, if we're going to take this exercise seriously. And the problem is that we can't find good social science doing so. The contemporary socioeconomic position of groups in a given society often bears no relationship to the historic wrongs they have suffered. So we're going to look at the examples of Japanese, Chinese, and Jews. These are people, all of whom have suffered great historic wrongs. So both in Canada and in the United States, the Japanese have significantly higher incomes than the whites, who have a documented history of severe anti-Japanese discrimination in both countries. So if our argument is going to be, in the past there was bad discrimination, and that bad discrimination explains why the members, the descendants rather, of the members of those groups are still not doing very well, then we have the problem of all of the counterexamples, groups that suffered terrible discrimination in the past, but somehow they have been able to overcome it and do better than the descendants of the people who were engaging in the horrific discrimination in the past. So the Japanese are doing better now than the whites who did the anti-Japanese discrimination in the past. The same story, Sowell goes on, could be told of the Chinese in Malaysia, Indonesia, and many other countries around the world, of the Jews in countries with virulent anti-Semitism, and a wide variety of other groups in a wide variety of other countries. So there is no correlation between what happened to one's group in the past with how one's group is doing now. There, of course, may be historically causal events, but there are lots of other issues at work here. And so, again, we can't just assume that bad discrimination in the past causes whatever problem culturally that we think exists multiple generations later. One contemporary example of how easy it is to go astray in such efforts, it was repeated for years that the high rate of single-parent teenage pregnancy among blacks was a legacy of slavery. So we might then say, as for one example, the concurrent problem that we are trying to address is that among blacks there's a high level of teenage pregnancy, and that's causing various kinds of other social problems. And then we say we want to solve that problem by doing some affirmative action. And we say, well, why are we doing affirmative action in this case? Because we are assuming that the affirmative action is necessary because we are tracing it back to bad things that happened to black people historically, and then we can properly cite all of the bad things that happened to black people historically, and then we want to say those bad things are causing the teenage pregnancy problem, so a kind of affirmative action is necessary here. And Sowell then wants to go on to argue that the history does not bear this out. But there's also a more serious problem that people who are committed to this hypothesis aren't really interested in the history or the evidence or trying to trace those causal connections. But when serious scholarly research was finally done on the subject, the evidence devastated this widely held belief. The vast majority of black children grew up in two-parent homes, even under slavery itself, and for generations thereafter. So slavery in the 1860s, two-parent households among black families for the most part. 1880, still two-parent households. 1905, 1925, 1945, still two-parent households. We jump another generation to the 1965 and on to 1985, and then suddenly we have a lot of single-parent households. The social science doesn't bear out that somehow it was what happened over a century ago that's causing that. Something else has to be at work. That means we need a different kind of analysis, not just blaming it on historical bad things that happens. Passionate commitment, then, to social justice can never be a substitute for knowing what you are talking about.